Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all and welcome to the final webinar of the Global Security Seminar series organized by the Near East Institute. My name is Mustafa Çıraklı and I'm the director of the Institute. As many of you will know, in these seminars, in each of these seminars, we try to focus on a different and an intriguing aspect of the global security agenda and its diverse and manifold manifestations. Today we continue with that focus, but also try to shed light onto an important aspect of the international security agenda, one that is perhaps a relatively newcomer to the agendas, onto the security agendas. And that is, of course, climate change and conflict and the nexus, I should say, between them. Now, we know and more evidence points out to the impact of climate change on conflict dynamics in many diverse settings. Climate change disrupts where people live, what they can eat, how they can earn a living and how they go on about their daily lives. And in fragile contexts such as Afghanistan, Mali, Sudan, the Sahel region, I should say, and this we see the impact of this nexus very clearly, and the impact, the tragic impact of it on increasing rates of instability and violence. But the way we go about conceptualizing this link between security and conflict, or conflict and climate change, it may sometimes be doing more harm than good, especially for the conflict settings and for the peace processes. This to some extent relates to the way we conceive security in the old-fashioned way, I should say, the traditional securitization approach, which sees the process as a bit of a top-down, state-centric process and doesn't really pay attention to its more human dimensions. So what are the ways in which we can desecuritize, perhaps, climate? What are the ways in which we can conceptualize a more holistic nexus between the two, so in order to improve the prospects for peace building? We are delighted and we are privileged to be joined this afternoon by a foremost expert on these issues, and that is, of course, Janani Vivekananda. She is one of the most qualified, I should say, to talk to us about these issues. And I know that she's on borrowed time, so I don't want to eat too much into her time. I'll just highlight her CV for you very quickly, and then I will give the floor to her. So Janani Vivekananda is the head of program for climate diplomacy and security at Adelphi, a Berlin-based think tank where she specializes in climate change and peace building. As a peace building practitioner with a background in peace and disaster risk reduction, field research and operations, her work focuses on connecting ground realities with policy processes and vice versa to promote the peace and climate action. Her work to date involves designing and conducting participatory and inclusive research on climate-related security risks and responses, promoting risk-informed responses, and increasing the capacity of governments and civil society to integrate climate and conflict risk into policies and field projects. Her particular interests and strengths lie in understanding the complexities of climate, conflict, and natural resource-related risks from a local contextual level and feeding these nuances into policy work. Janani, of course, holds master's degrees from the School of Oriental and African Studies, in other words, SOAS, from the University of London, and of course, the prestigious University of Oxford. Janani, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Like I said, I know you are on borrowed time, so I don't want to eat too much into your time, and I'll give the floor to you. But of course, with each talk, we will open the floor for question and discussions afterwards. So without any further ado, Janani, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real honor and a privilege. So as you pointed out, recognizing the links between climate, peace, and security is incredibly important. I do have some slides if you're able to share them then.
I will be doing that very, very quickly now. Yes, here we are.
Perfect. Thank you. So it's incredibly important because the impacts of climate change and those of conflict are mutually reinforcing. So climate impacts, as you mentioned in the introduction, these impacts compound the drivers of conflict and make peace harder to achieve. But if we flip this over, peace and sustainable environmental practices are thus also mutually reinforcing. So I'd like to talk to you today about how and why we need to build climate resilience while building peace. And I'll do so by first setting out some of the pathways through which climate and conflict come together, through 5 pathways, and I'll end with some thoughts on what to do about them. So next slide, please. These risks that climate change pose are real and present, and they are compound, they're messy, they're complex. So this isn't something that's hypothetical. There's solid evidence on this. And it's also not just something that we're predicting to happen in the future, they're happening now. So we need to understand them, we need to be able to anticipate them in order to ensure that we are doing no harm, so that we can prevent these risks from cascading into further risks where possible, and where it's not possible and we're too late, to ensure that we are able to respond to them. Next slide, thanks. So into the pathways. The first pathway is that climate change impacts affect competition over natural resources such as land and water. So the impacts such as drought, intense rainfall, and changing temperatures can change the availability to and access to natural resources that are highly sensitive to climate and environmental changes, things like land, water, and food. And this can fuel competition and tensions, which can contribute to violence if natural resource and conflict management institutions are dysfunctional. Now, I'd really like to underscore this if, because it's not about the shortage of resources per se, it's about where these changes in climate affect access to a resource which may have already been inequitable. So it's about the efficacy of the pre-existing resource, a natural resource or conflict management institutions such as the formal judiciary or kind of local governance, natural resource governance structures. So climate change can come along and entrench pre-existing structural unfairness, for example, preferential access to a resource such as grazing land, which might have been granted to one identity group over another because that's the same identity group as the governing party, for example, or where there are no longer effective dispute resolution mechanisms to deal with resource conflicts without violence, perhaps because of a conflict which has eroded existing governance structures. So it's not necessarily about fixing the issue of scarcity, but about building or restoring inclusive, equitable, and predictable governance systems, be they formal or informal, to support the management of these changing resources, the inevitable, unpredictable changing of resources that we'll be seeing in the face of a changing climate. So this is then about governance, about rebuilding state institutions as much as it is about addressing climate hazards and climate adaptation. Next slide, please. The second insight is around climate impacts undermining livelihoods, and this can affect human mobility, and it can push people into illegal coping mechanisms. So the adverse impacts of climate on jobs can push people to move or change their regular migratory patterns, which could then put them in conflict with other groups, especially when they're moving to places where resources are already stressed. Now, in Europe, and particularly in the Mediterranean region, we often hear this couched as kind of a movement of people from the Sahel or from North Africa into Europe, but that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows that most of this mobility is internal, it's rural to urban, or it's from rural communities to other rural communities. And it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's a important coping strategy where people are able to then move to be able to cope with the impacts of climate change. So I want to caveat this just to stress that migration and mobility is not in and of itself a bad thing, but we need to understand the dynamics and understand how they can be contributing to pre-existing grievances. So we saw an example of this in the research that I led in the Lake Chad region, where we saw that as the islands on the lake became less livable, as the waters of the lake rose, flooding much of the island, more people moved to the mainland, creating increased competition for the increasingly scarce amount of arable, livable land. The shores around Lake Chad are incredibly fertile, much of it's being used for farming, but because of the conflict in the region, the conflict that's been going on for over a decade, more and more people have been displaced from other parts of the Lake Chad region, and there are more and more people trying to live on less and less available and safe land. So the incomers from the island were then in conflict with the host communities who were already there. And we saw increased violence as there were no kind of land rights or clearly defined agreements, customary agreements as to who could settle where. And we also saw more people joining armed opposition groups such as Boko Haram or Islamic State West Africa Province, citing the lack of alternative livelihoods, because their traditional livelihoods of farming or fishing or pastoralism were becoming less predictable because of the variability of climate change and less viable. And so people were seeking a more predictable, more sustainable livelihood. And so the steady income provided by armed groups and criminality became a more viable economic long-term solution in the face of climate change. Next slide, please. So here we can see the pathway illustrated. I mentioned people looking to alternative, perhaps illegal livelihood strategies. Other examples include drug production, as we've seen in Afghanistan, or charcoal production in Somalia, or small-scale artisanal mining of minerals or metals such as gold in Sudan. Some of these things in and of themselves are not bad, but they can be co-opted by armed groups or criminal organizations, or they can also be very detrimental to climate change. For example, charcoal production, which locks people into the climate stress, which made their livelihoods less viable in the first place, for example, through deforestation to produce charcoal. Now, I also want to stress that gender norms play a role throughout all of the pathways I'm going to speak about, but especially this one. And it's really important to understand the disaggregated nature of whose livelihoods are affected, who migrates. In some contexts, it's men that will be moving. In some social and religious context. It will be the women, who stays at home, how this affects the roles, gender roles, ideas of masculinity. This is really important to understand, particularly when we think about roles of masculinity in shaping recruitment into armed opposition groups, and why the incentives and motivations as to why people join these groups. Next slide, thanks. The third pathway is about how climate change impacts contribute to extreme food price spikes and food insecurity. Now, this is perhaps the most well-documented example of climate change related violence. And we saw this highlighted by the food riots around the world in 2007 and then again in 2011, related to very sudden rises in food prices. And we're likely to see the same again. Hopefully not with violence, but as food prices are rising. We've already seen instability in Iran, as a tripling of food prices coincided with a poor government response to support people with this food price volatility. So we will see declining rural incomes affecting poverty and vulnerability, and this connects to climate shocks and conflict risks. And this is especially the case in regions most dependent on agriculture or on food imports. And this is mostly, if we look globally, mostly in the Middle East and North African region. Next slide, please. So here you see the illustrated pathway. So the impacts of climate change on agriculture: decrease the harvest, increase prices, which contributes to more volatile food prices and a more volatile food supply, which, alongside other kind of geopolitical issues such as the war in Ukraine, is especially problematic for countries which are dependent on food imports. And this, as I said, it can serve as a catalyst to protests and create political instability. And in some contexts, it can be destabilizing. So the Middle East region, as I mentioned, is already dependent on, for more than 50% of its food supply dependent on imports. And while sensitivity to food prices rises due to supply stress, due to other geopolitical reasons, climate change on top of this can make an already difficult, sticky political situation worse. And if it's not governed carefully, this can have a very strong compounding effect on people's grievances. The next slide, thank you. The fourth pathway is around extreme weather events and how extreme shocks caused by sudden climate impacts, such as a flood or storm surges, can affect government effectiveness and undermine or challenge their legitimacy. So basically, the impacts of climate change challenges governments if they don't rise to the challenge of addressing this basic government requirement of safeguarding the security, the physical security of their people. And if they're not able to do this, it can undermine their legitimacy. The flip side is that if a government is seen, or an entity, a kind of non-state entity, is seen to deal with an extreme event very effectively, this can actually bolster legitimacy. And we saw this after the tsunami in Indonesia back in 2004. We saw that the then terrorist group, or they were on the US and EU's global list of terror, the Free Aceh movement, the GAM, the response by the GAM in East Timor was seen to be so inclusive and effective that this helped bring them to the political negotiation table by the international community, which then kind of gave them a legitimacy to be part of the peace talks. So it can work both ways. Next slide, thanks. The fifth slide and the final pathway I want to talk about is not about the impacts of climate change, but actually the unintended consequences of poorly designed climate and security policies, which carry their own risks. So we can see, and we have historically seen, how pivots to green pathways, low carbon strategies, a pivot to renewable energy, for example, need to take care of shifting power dynamics. For example, if we look at oil-producing countries, if we pivot to renewables without thinking about how the new winners and losers will respond, this can create power vacuums that can be potentially destabilizing. To give another example, in 2007, 2008, the EU decided to pivot to biofuels to try and fulfill its commitment to have 20% renewable energy by 2020. And this meant that it very rapidly switched a lot of agrarian agricultural land to produce bioethanol for biofuels. And this suddenly brought down food production, which had an impact on food prices, which contributed to the food price shocks of 2008, which fed into the food riots, which I mentioned in the previous pathways. And we can see something similar potentially playing out with the sudden move towards electric vehicles and batteries. So it's excellent to see this push towards EVs and the private sector getting into this on the investment and technology side. But we can also see that there's going to be, or already is, a scramble for critical minerals, many of which are located in mineral-rich but governance-poor contexts like the DRC, and we're likely to see this sudden increased value in resources like lithium and cobalt that are needed to produce batteries for electric vehicles, creating rent-seeking behaviors of elites and armed groups and criminal groups, and creating new economies of war, which, if they're not governed carefully, can kind of lock in incentives to fuel a war economy. So climate action, be it mitigation or adaptation, should thus be designed in ways that don't undermine livelihoods, don't undermine structural inequalities or people's existing coping capacities to deal with conflict dynamics. And equally important is the other side, on the peace building side, that peace building strategies take account of climate predictions, because if you need peace to be sustainable for 5, 10, 50, 30, 50, 100 years, we need to know what the environment looks like in the decades ahead, and ensure that whatever peace building measures are put in place are able to stand the climate test, are able to be sustainable in the face of a changing climate. Next slide, thank you. So they're the 5 pathways. If we accept that these are examples of the kind of cascading risks, it's not comprehensive. These pathways, these different climate impacts will interact in different ways in different contexts. This was just a kind of an overarching framework to try to visualize some of these pathways. If we understand that these cascading risks can have an impact on security, it also means that responses to climate change can yield peace-building dividends, and responses to peace and stabilization can also have a positive impact on climate adaptation if, and it's a very big if they're done well. And by that I mean if they're done with conflict sensitivity in ways that promote inclusion and social cohesion and equity, all these things that underlie the drivers of conflict. And if we can do it like that, then these climate responses and peace building can help to contribute to building trust, to legitimize formal and informal institutions, and rebuild, or in fact even build, because perhaps in some contexts it wasn't there to start with, build the social contract, which is integral for both building resilience to conflict, but also to climate change. Now, there's little value in generalizing across different geographic contexts, but from my work over the years, there are still some clearly generalizable principles about how to effectively address climate security risks through peace building and peacemaking. So I don't want to keep it too generic. I'll try to identify a few very specific things that can be done. And they're essentially about building community resilience to cope better with the variability of climate change without violence. And this is essentially through rebuilding social cohesion, strengthening the social contract, and enable better climate security risk-informed decision-making. So I'll just end with 4 concrete steps on how we can make peace building more climate sensitive and how we can get climate action to be more conflict sensitive. So the first step is around addressing the governance issue. Both inclusive and effective governance and social cohesion are key to coping with shocks and stresses such as conflict and climate change. If we look below the surface, the drivers of vulnerability to conflict and to climate risks are often the same. They're poverty, they're marginalization, they're inequality. And so addressing those underlying factors through effective governance gives us a better chance at hitting this double dividend. It's important to think about who's affected by these risks. It's not that climate change will affect everyone equally. It's important to think about groups that were previously marginalized, for example, on the grounds of age or gender or social status, ethnicity or religion. If these groups, who are then the most vulnerable to climate, often because of their marginalization, also most excluded from decision-making, if they're included in decision-making over things like natural resource management, as well as conflict resolution, if they're included in decision-making over natural resource management, this can then have a peace-building dividend, because one, the resource sharing mechanisms are going to be more inclusive and therefore much more sustainable. And it's also going to build social cohesion, including these marginalized groups, and addressing that kind of political vacuum, giving them a voice. The second step is that we need to better understand how these risks come together in different contexts. We need to contextualize climate fragility risks, not just think about them in the abstract, but have better regularized, integrated analysis situating climate fragility risks in a particular context, so that we can then identify and understand the specific ways in which these pathways that I outlined very broadly interact in a very specific context with the very specific actors at play in a specific context. So this kind of analysis should combine conflict analysis at as local a level as possible, along with climate impact analysis, climate vulnerability analysis, which is disaggregated on gender, on age, on all these kind of potential intersectional factors which drive marginalization, to understand the different impacts on different groups, because the who is just as important as the what and the how. The third concrete thing that can be done is to focus on the availability, restoration, and access to natural resources. So improving natural resource management mechanisms can serve as a really effective first entry point to conflict and disaster risk reduction. It can also help to create an enabling institutional environment for promoting the goals of building resilience and building peace simultaneously. And it can also have a quick positive impact on livelihoods and income generation, which are really core components of building sustainable peace. And the fourth and final step that I want to end with is supporting sustainable livelihoods and livelihood diversification. One of the key factors that we came across in our research in the Lake Chad region, but also in the research that we've done on climate security risk analyses around the world, from the Pacific to the Sahel to the Horn of Africa to Central America, is that it's the economic vulnerability that that pushes people into perhaps negative coping mechanisms. So improving the sustainability of livelihoods and providing alternative forms of livelihoods that are both climate proof and peace positive can be a really effective way of addressing the important economic drivers of conflict, as well as providing people with more economic or financial assets so that they can better cope with the risks posed by climate change. So livelihood diversification and thinking about income that's climate proof another important factor to think about conflict and climate resilient sustainable development. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions and look forward to an interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janani, for sharing with us those fascinating insights. I've been getting lots of messages of appreciation, of course, from our students, but also from the members of the faculty. Now, of course, the power of the chair. I'm going to have a few questions, if you don't mind, to get things going. But of course, those of you who are watching us, our audiences, they're also more than welcome to share their questions or thoughts with us. Now, you talked a little bit about the Lake Chad region, and I was having a quick look at this this morning, and I came across it may be your work, I'm not sure, but it defines Lake Chad as something of a poster child for climate security. And there's this quote from Barack Obama, who was the U.S. president at the time. He said, "To understand climate change did not cause the conflicts we see around the world. Yet what we also know is that severe drought helped to create the instability in Nigeria that was exploited by the terrorist group Boko Haram." Now, excuse me, to me, it seems like there is a certain understanding. Yet the problem is turning this understanding into action on both the part of the US, but also the EU. Now, I was wondering if, because you are aware of the EU's Sahel strategy, how would you see? Do you think that that reflects and takes on board some of the insights that you shared with us? Do you think that there is that understanding when it comes to implementing this strategy that takes into account the conflict sensitive, we call them, the conflict sensitive and the contextual factors there?
Thank you. It's a great question. This is one of the biggest challenges we face, so that there is an increasing awareness. You mentioned Lake Chad. It is indeed often a poster child for climate security, but one of the most compelling things that I found in the work that we did on the region is that by going in, because there's a lot of attention on Lake Chad, but almost all of the resources are there for stabilization because of the risk of terror, and this is the geopolitical priority over climate impacts. But what we found is that there's a narrative that, as you mentioned, has been kind of hijacked by political actors to serve their own ends, and this is a narrative that Lake is shrinking, and it goes like this: Lake Chad is shrinking because of climate change, and so this is creating lots of unemployed, angry young men who are joining Boko Haram, and that's why we have this problem of terror in the Lake Chad region in northeastern Nigeria and the surrounding states. The reality is that yes, there's a climate problem that is affecting livelihoods, but it's not that the lake is shrinking. It's that the rainfall is so variable that the livelihoods around the lake are very unpredictable. So yes, we need to understand the climate impacts, but it's not as simple as saying that the lake is shrinking, because this was then leading to a solution put forward by the government in the region, particularly the government of Nigeria, to refill the lake. And this is an example of using climate change to almost kind of manipulate the international donor community to get investments into something which will be incredibly lucrative for the national governments. We know that the biggest amount of of corruption is within kind of big infra projects. So yes, building a huge $50 billion pipeline to refill Lake Chad will be very beneficial for the government of Nigeria, but not very beneficial at all for the people of Lake Chad, who actually depend on the variability in the lake. Recession, as the waters go down, they can farm the receded floodplains, and then when the waters are higher, they can fish. So it's incredibly important to actually go in and understand the climate impacts and not rely on kind of received wisdom or assumptions. When it comes to the EU strategy, it's also very important to flag, because yes, the EU was then relying on these narratives, and we were able to ensure that yes, now there is, compared with 5 years ago, a stronger understanding that you do need to bring climate impact data current, not just historical, because the future does not look like the past. So we need to invest in the climate analysis and feed that in. The problem is, when you look at the Sahel strategy of the EU, it doesn't cross the knowledge divides. So if it's looking at resilience, then it's not looking at conflict. If there's a chapter on stabilization and peace building in the region, it's climate blind, because you haven't got people within the conflict and stabilization divisions who are able to bring in the kind of the climate lens to think about what impacts this will have on people's climate resilience. So we see strategies by EU member states doing things that in the region that are incredibly detrimental to climate resilience. We see this in Mali. We see kind of very, very environmentally detrimental responses to stabilizing the jihadi situation in Mali. Things like scorched earth tactics being used by the international by the G5 Sahel, for example, or the French military campaign, or the Dutch and the Germans. They're all using these kind of strategies, which then undermine people's climate resilience, because
So
they can't use this land.
These are the forces that are leading the counter-insurgency operations, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The national as well as the international forces, but they're focusing on stabilization strategies to neutralize the jihadi forces, but they're not thinking about the climate piece. And that might seem like it's not relevant, but when we go on the ground, when we do the field research, you see that the people who are just civilians, then very rapidly become radicalized or can be pushed into joining armed groups or into kind of anti-government positions, because the responses to the jihadi movement have taken away their livelihoods. If international peacekeeping forces or stabilization forces have come in and burnt your farmland because they wanted to kind of smoke out jihadis, then as a farmer, you've got no livelihood. So what do? You're far more susceptible to alternative livelihood sources provided by armed groups. So yeah, so at the moment, there's still work to be done. It's moving, and it's moving faster than before, and it's moving in the right direction. But I think the EU in particular is facing real kind of institutional, structural silos to really connect its kind of climate security thinking with its kind of big climate spend. It's made some really good commitments, particularly with the last COP, to invest in climate action, but it's not linking that to kind of its conflict thinking to make sure it's conflict sensitive, and its stabilization and resilience work in fragile states is still not climate risk informed, shall we say.
It's interesting you mentioned the latest COP. I've been, trying to dig some information on the sort of the expectations, but also the assessment. I mean, some people call it a suicide pact, right? In the sense that it did not deliver, and there's a lot of criticism, especially the fact that I think it was one of the global corporations that were sponsoring it. There were lots of lobbying there, around 600 fossil fuel lobbyists. That's a huge number. I mean, what's your take on the COP itself? Do you think that it's a body that could sort of deliver, or do you think that there needs to be a sort of a revamp in the way we think about it to make it sort of more robust, something that is more beefed up to be able to implement its decisions?
No, now look, I think the COP is flawed in many ways. The process is not ideal, but with the clock ticking, there's no time to try to revamp or redraw the framework or create a new process or a new institution. I think, just to be very pragmatic, we've got to work with the system that we've got, perhaps find other mechanisms in parallel. It's not just the UN FCCC process. I think there's also a lot of scope for progress to happen through other channels, through regional bodies, through other kind of small alliances of multilateral states. It doesn't have to be all the member states, because, you know, moving together at the global level is slow and arduous. But we do, you know, not in this COP, but in a previous COP, we saw some really impressive action at the non-state level, at the cities level, or states. For example, California, we're just not waiting for a global agreement. The US wasn't in the last COP, but they were able to move ahead just as a state. So I think there are other ways that we can think about progress. But to be positive about this COP, yes, there was a lot of lobbying by fossil fuel groups, and you know, the COP next year will be in the United Arab Emirates. So what are we going to see there? But this was also a COP where we saw adaptation and loss and damage come to the fore, and these are, you know, it was called the African COP. These are the issues that are most affecting the most fragile people. Mitigation is incredibly important. It has to be our first line of defense, of course, but for people who are already facing this vulnerability, if it's that are facing this you know, they're at the coalface. This is their daily reality. It's not just, oh, our electricity bills are a little bit higher. It's my livelihood is no longer viable. This is important. So I think this COP did push us forward on giving more attention. It was unfortunately to the detriment of mitigation, but we saw more attention on adaptation, more resourcing, more importance given to this. Which is a positive thing for peace and security, because adaptation, without this, then those who are most affected in fragile contexts are going to be kind of locked into cycles of climate vulnerability and conflict, and also loss and damage, which is incredibly important, because the same kind of drivers of what makes people vulnerable to losses are and the damages posed by climate change are those same drivers of conflict. So there's a real capacity, if we get, like I mentioned in my kind of concluding points, if we do it right, if we ensure that the preventative, you know, the efforts that people are putting into anticipatory action, there were some big initiatives, things like Global Shield, big, not big enough, but still big initiatives to invest in anticipating and then investing through insurance, for example, to prevent these climate losses ahead of time. This can also be seen as a really effective way of conflict prevention, investing in conflict prevention and in building sustainable peace, if they're done in a conflict-sensitive way. So I think there's my glass half full take on the COP.
Perfect. No,
also, just to underscore, it was the first COP where climate and security was part of the discussion. Through the presidency, a formal part of the discussion.
True. I'm aware of the time, but just one final question, a quick one, if I may. And that will be the last one, I think, because we don't want to hold you too much. Just to bring things a little bit closer home, for me anyway, for Cyprus, which is, of course, a conflict setting. But I think it also applies to other conflict settings too, and to these deeply divided societies and so on. As soon as you sort of bring new issues onto the agenda in peace building processes, we see that sometimes these new issues are quickly hijacked and they are then articulated with the traditional grievances. So it just becomes a part of the conflict narrative. So I wonder if you've done any work on this, or perhaps you could share some of your reflections. Do you reckon we could avoid this somehow from happening, or what needs to be done to stop these sort of counter peace dynamics that work against peace when they spill over into issues of climate change as well?
I'm not sure I understand your question completely. So how do we ensure that climate impacts don't derail peace processes?
To some extent, because what happens is that you have a certain agenda when you are trying to sort of negotiate a peace deal, and sometimes new issues enter those agendas, perhaps as confidence building measures or other ways. And what we then see in some cases, including to some extent Cyprus, these are quickly captured by one or the other side to the detriment of the peace process. What they do is that they take the climate change issue, and even though it's an issue that sort of it's cross-border and it impacts both sides, they still use it to promote their own rhetoric and understanding of that conflict. Make sense?
Yes, sorry, I get you now. So yes, I mean, in the case of Cyprus, I mean, it's a great example because it's such a small geographic context where the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, on the changes in rainfall, the increased temperature, and droughts affect both sides. So it should be common ground and a space for kind of shared discussions, maybe even an entry point for kind of a political settlement or some kind of mediation process. But yes, you're right, it can be hijacked and politicized. But there are examples of where it has opened a space for discourse, maybe not always at track one level, but if you look at the Middle East, it's fractious, but you can see that there are dialogues at different levels at track 1.5, but even down to the community level, down with kind of farmers who are drawing on the same waters of the River Jordan across the three bordering states. And there's been a lot of engagement to create awareness and understanding at that very local level that this is shared water. If you over pump, you are not just harming your neighbor. If you're in Jordan, you're not just harming your neighbor across the line, but you're also undermining this resource for yourself and for your children. But if you pollute it, if you whatever you do, this is a collective resource, and therefore any efforts to preserve it are also collective. You're helping yourself, but you're also helping your neighbors. So this work has started at a very early age because these sentiments around kind of environmental destruction to harm your neighbor can lock in quite early, right? We'll take all the water so that they can't have any. So it's totally counterproductive, but it is it's a mindset, right? This is ours, let's keep it. But this idea of sharing and cooperation is being taught in schools in some of these regions, and it's a really interesting pilot. It's kind of peace education around cooperation over resources. So I think it's hard. I think it's maybe an intergenerational thing, and perhaps something where the newer generation that is very, very aware of the importance of cooperation over the environment. It's not our environment versus your environment. It is our collective environment. We've got no way of separating out the impacts of climate So let's cooperate. At the political level, I think it's a lot harder, to be very pragmatic. It's just then about finding the incentives to ensure that the environment is brought to the table as, to show that there's something in it for all the parties to the conflict.
So like a win-win sort of case.
Absolutely. But then it's of course very, very important that this whole point about understanding the resource implications on all parts of society. So not so much the case with Cyprus, but in many contexts, the people at the negotiation table, if you're thinking about Afghanistan or Nigeria, their interest in the resource at play, be it land or water, will not be the interest of a particular identity group who might not be in favor with that particular political party, for example. So I think that in terms of ensuring that a peace process is actually promoting the kind of a sustainable peace solution around natural resources, there needs to be an awareness. Whoever's mediating that process needs to be aware of the kind of the incentives for elite capture of a resource through a political settlement.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Janani, for joining us this afternoon. Although I believe it's just before 12 o'clock in Berlin, right?
No, it's a real pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you. We hope that one day you'll also be able to join us in person here in Cyprus.
That would be wonderful.
And thank you also the members of the audience who've been watching us. Please do follow us on social media. The Institute, of course, is on Facebook and on Twitter to remain up to date with the upcoming events and publications. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.